Excellent. Thank you so much. Lord Sharma always gives you the honesty. So it was a great panel, great honest discussion. I just try to summarize it a little bit before we move on to our next session. Firstly, deploying transition finance at pace and scale, that is important. We heard about that. And I think the discussion showed that how high the stakes are, and we all have to act fast. We have seen how finance can make clean energy cheaper and more accessible, bring job opportunities and innovation. Now we need to apply a similar model to other industries, especially transport, agriculture, and other high-emitting sectors to enable just transition. We also heard that UK has got the tools to lead on transition finance, but we must act now. And if we don't, we risk being falling behind of other markets. That's why the Transition Finance Council is pushing the agenda. And then if transition finance to succeed, it creates wins for customers, businesses, government, who all have a role to play in this agenda. And we heard real-life examples, absolutely, from HSBC about how they are deploying capital. So moving towards investable NDCs was a very good input, and also how can we enable playbooks. So one of the things I mentioned before the panel is the call for evidence on the sectoral transition pathways that will be launched later in this week with exactly that in mind. So again, very many things to talk about, but I think we need to move on in our agenda. Now we are actually on our third panel covering an incredible topic, carbon markets. So there's, again, so much to say. I will try to introduce the panel with a few remarks. So carbon markets represent a powerful lever in the journey to net zero. And they play a vital role in channeling capital towards essential low-carbon technologies, as well as supporting climate action in emerging markets and developing countries. Yet, both in the UK and globally, carbon markets have faced a very complex, at times turbulent path. And why is that? Despite the surge of innovation, effort, commitment, the demand for voluntary carbon credits has remained subdued. As we heard in the Nature panel earlier today, there are compelling reasons that 2025 offers a pivotal moment, especially in the light of COP30 at Belém, to reinvigorate the carbon markets and nature credits as well, to unlock the full potential in these areas. So now to explore how we can seize the opportunity and also address the challenges, build more credible, scalable carbon markets, I'm delighted to welcome our third panel of today. The panel is moderated by Gordon Bennett, Global Head of Environmental Markets at Intercontinental Exchange. And please, you can come onto the stage as I'm introducing you. And our speakers are Natalia Dorfman, CEO and co-founder of Kita, insurance sector. Greg Murray, CEO and co-founder of Coco Networks. David Frank, Director, Policy Engagement, Environmental Sustainability Policy Team at Microsoft. And Professor Lucia Reich, I hope I pronounced it right, Director of the Al Arian Institute, Behavioral Economics and Policy at University of Cambridge. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I stood up last year, so I'm going to start again with a stand-up and actually a confession. I find these events quite difficult because a decade ago, I was getting leadership coaching and I was diagnosed as a shy extrovert. So how does that manifest itself? It means I sort of oscillate between the sort of the stoicism of Andy Murray, otherwise known as Doer, and the sort of the edgy enthusiasm of Gordon Ramsay. So that's a tightrope. But last year we had a bit of a game show theme, and it seemed to go quite well. It was a case of, tonight, Matthew, I'm Jeremy Clarkson, and we played Who Wants to Be a Carbonaire? So I thought we could do it again. That was actually an example of the wisdom of the crowd, which is maybe a bit more Leslie Crowther and Price is Right. But I wanted to ask 3 questions. You can just nod or you can shout if you're not shy. You know, first of all, is the atmosphere a scarce resource? Is the root cause of climate risk the fact that the atmosphere is largely free to use? And then my last question is the definition of net zero every ton you put in, you take a ton out? And if you can answer yes to some of those, or even all of them, you're really an advocate for carbon pricing, which is a great thing, because carbon pricing prices the use of the atmosphere, but you're also an advocate of carbon credits, because if you believe in the definition of net zero, the currency of a carbon removal is a carbon credit. So now we'll go on to the panel, a great panel, and first of all, keep the market theme going in terms of opening offers. And I listened to Andrew Steer in the morning, and he told the story of the wildebeest, which is in terms of behaviors. And so I thought that's quite an interesting start, because we have a behavioral expert on the panel. So we're very pleased to have you, Lucia. And so collectively, we seem to have developed a long-standing bad habit of using the atmosphere for free. And at scale, we only really pay for our emissions if we're made to by governments. So you've worked with Cass Sunstein, along with Richard Thaler, and who authored Nudge, Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness. So drawing on your experience as an academic and changing behaviors, what mechanisms or frames have proven effective in making better environmental choices?
Right, thank you. So we are indeed creatures of habits. Maybe we can add a little bit more cognition to our decisions than the wildebeest, but still, I mean, we are much more biased, we use more heuristics, we are very strongly dependent on context, on the affordances of immediate context, on incentives than we think, and also than policymakers often think. And as a behavioral economist, this is exactly what we try to do. We try to understand how people actually tick, how people really make decisions, not the textbook econs, but the humans, how we really make decisions, and then try to design instruments. Some people call them nudges, choice architecture. We have educational nudges, architectural nudges, and use that knowledge to create mechanisms and interventions. So probably some of the most robust and most forceful ones are defaults. This is also something that has been used in carbon markets. So there's the possibility to opt in by default airline passengers into carbon offsets. You're not forcing them, because they can still opt out. But we are not just creatures of habits, we're also pretty lazy, and we're completely over. We have to do many, many decisions. There's something like decision fatigues, at least at the end of the day, when we book our flights. And we might not even realize that we are actually opted in. So that's just one idea, one mechanism. Another one is, so we can use framing. It really, really, really matters. This morning I heard a lot of carbon pricing, carbon taxes. Yes, for an economist, this is good. However, if you ask behavioral economists, and we do a lot of experiments, this is how we actually work in the lab and in the field, we find that just using another word, such as a carbon dividend or a rebate or an offset, for exactly the same policy, increases uptake, approval, and approval of the policy.
Great.
So these are the little tricks.
Thank you. So you can't have a market without demand, so we're going to come to you now, David. Microsoft's one of the largest carbon removal buyers, stepping in to create a demand signal that doesn't yet exist at scale. So what triggered Microsoft to act early in the absence of a legislative mandate?
It's a great question. If I take a step back, our corporate ambition or mission is to empower every person and organization on the planet to achieve more by using our technology. And what that means is we think about having a social license to operate. So how do we best serve the communities who are using our technology? And we think carefully about the impact of our technology has as we're addressing big societal challenges. And so in this space, that was a sort of input, as well as this, we were obviously aware of this sort of growing scientific consensus around the urgency of corporates needing to act. So there was a signal into us. And then that sort of came to those sort of inputs from outside, which weren't about regulation, but were just about growing concerns about environmental change and climate challenge, and what was driving that. Led to us, a number of senior leaders over a number of years working to think through what role does Microsoft have to play to address that, which then came together just over 5 years ago, so January 2020. I think it was actually about 2 weeks before the first media reports about the pandemic started appearing. We made our big sort of climate commitments, and just for sort of context, that was about being carbon negative by 2030, being water positive, protecting more land than we use, and then the key one in this context about removing all historical emissions we've been responsible for as a company since our foundation, to do that by 2050. And so that was driven on hard science, and then at the same time, we launched $1 billion US sort of our climate innovation fund, which is an impact investment fund, which is about using our capital to invest in technologies to address carbon removal. And we then took a two-pronged approach. We sort of reduction as much as possible, and then using carbon removal to address the bits of the business which were just exceptionally difficult. And therefore we needed to use carbon removal and be active in that market, and we recognized we'd need to build that market. And that also meant building the internal team. So when this process started at Microsoft 5 years ago, the carbon removal team was 3 people. It's now about 16 or 17 people. And when we put the first sort of RFP out, asking for people to come to us with suggestions to help us think about where we should deploy our sort of capital to help start building a market, to your point, no surprise, we got a lot of nature-based sort of proposals. And we realized that those would really be key, but we needed to take a blended approach. And so that sort of was the trigger to act early, and sort of what has continued to sort of drive our approach.
Great, so behavior, demand. Greg, you're on the supply side, and we sort of keep our carbon hat on. You're a producer of carbon credit reductions, but you're much more than that. Can you let us know a little bit more about you and Cocoa Networks, what you're doing on the ground?
Sure, thanks. So Cocoa is a technology company first and foremost. So we've built the hardware and software technologies that enable a new type of energy utility, residential energy utility, to be built in the cities in low-income tropical forest countries. Right, so that's what the tech platform is for. We then went and used that tech platform to build the first utility using this technology, which is in Kenya. And today we supply about 25% of homes across urban Kenya, across 12 cities and towns, with clean molecules for residential heat. So the biggest utility in Kenya is the state monopoly. It's called Kenya Power. They do electrons for lighting and appliances and so on. Anyone that's put their mind to the challenge of decarbonizing residential heat wherever you are in the world, it's very expensive, and electricity is often the most expensive way to do heat. And that's the case in the Kenyan context, where the heating use case is, of course, putting energy into food. So from an energy systems perspective, the most expensive solution is electricity. Then the most expensive solution, the next one, is piped gas, like you have in your homes here. And then below that, you have bottled gas, which is what you see, cylinders of LPG you see in the developing world. And we come in lower cost than that and supply clean molecules, bioethanol, cooking fuel across the cities and towns through this dense network of high-tech fuel ATMs located in corner stores. It's a new concept, but has now worked at scale. Where carbon comes into it, the emissions that are reduced through energy, through transitioning cities, and indeed the nation, from reliance on charcoal, for example, as a deforestation fuel, enables emissions reductions, which are then quantified and verified, targeting primarily compliance markets globally. And we use that revenue because we sell the energy services well below cost, right? So we use that revenue as a non-government energy subsidy to enable it to be affordable for even the poorest households in the slums across the cities and towns, right? So that's the Cocoa mechanism. It's really carbon for energy transition and forest protection. And we're a 10-year-old company. The first 5 years was building the technology. The next 5 years was proving it at some scale. We've invested about $300 million, mainly equity, wide range of shareholders, including the Climate Innovation Fund from Microsoft. Despite us not doing removals in the Western U.S. definition of it, we're doing transition, I suppose, is the better definition. But Microsoft also has a focus on equity and on trying to solve some of these difficult problems in the climate space that otherwise are sort of left on the side. And so that's where there was a meeting of mine some years ago.
Great, thank you. So now let's delve into sort of traditional financial risk management tools, Natalia. So insurance is a foundational layer of any high-value market, but it's still nascent in the carbon space. So could you explain why insurance is critical and what types of events you're insuring for in carbon credits?
Yes, of course. And so I'm Natalia Dorfman. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Kita. We're a specialist insurance company for the carbon markets. And I think why insurance is necessary, like you referenced, there's really no high-value market. I mean, as many of you will know, there's no high-value market in the world that doesn't have insurance as part of it in one way or another. And the carbon markets have historically not had insurance. I think in part that's because aspects of financing carbon projects has been to some extent philanthropic. And philanthropic, or sort of, the kind of amount of money you're willing to lose doesn't need to be insured. But when we're looking at scaling up this market to be removing billions of tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, that needs trillions of dollars of investment. And really, because these projects, particularly removals projects, but really any project takes years to scale up, if you want to be removing those billions of tons by mid-2030s or 2050, you really need to be financing the projects today. And so who has the capital like that to deploy today? It's the financial institutions. How do they deploy capital? In structures that they expect to see within their risk, governance, compliance, et cetera teams, structures they've utilized in other markets. And I think insurance is essential to be able to enable those structures within carbon. And so we tend to work with investors, increasingly banks, who are looking at financing projects in structures almost like you'd see in renewables with PPAs. But really they're looking to protect their investment against underperformance of the project, such that they can deliver to the off-taker and make their return, and we're protecting them against the risk they don't do that.
Cool.
Yeah, I'll stop there, but I guess the insurance really right now is looking to replicate forms of insurance that you would see in other markets, credit insurance, political risk insurance, and just apply it to carbon. Likewise, we are starting to see other utilizations of insurance. For example, fire insurance for trees, of course, can be applied to the carbon markets, professional liability, these types of things. I would expect that as we evolve, we'll see a pretty sophisticated insurance market come out, but right now it still is being led by specialists such as ourselves.
Yeah, so you mentioned trillions of dollars and you mentioned scale. When we talk about carbon markets quite a lot and we mentioned scaling, I'd be interested to hear from other people on the panel in terms of how you think about what does scale mean, either in terms of tons or in terms of dollars investment? Maybe, Greg, how many tons do you think we need? How many tons can cocoa deliver and the clean cooking space deliver?
Well, I mean, dirty cooking in Africa alone is about the same size from a pollution perspective as the global aviation industry. So it's about 2% of global emissions. So it's significant from a global perspective. But I mean, I think the problem statement in my mind always comes down to how do we extend regulatory and compliance pricing across the greatest volume of global emissions, noting that the hard to abate emissions, the expensive emissions, are often located in the sectors where there is a low company profit margin per ton of pollution. If you did the sums, Microsoft has a very high profit margin per ton of pollution, and so can take this leadership position as with other technology companies that are leading carbon removals. So they can lead, but you can't really do that in the aviation industry. You can't really do that in the steel production or in the energy utility industry, right? Because ultimately going and adopting really high price, you end up exceeding your margin per ton. And so it's that economic equation of how do we actually grow the coverage in these very, very polluting, hard to abate sectors. And in my mind, that's quite tricky to ask companies to sort of lead and create that competitive dislocation with each other in these sort of difficult to abate and highly competed industries. And so it's more that relative to capacity to pay, effectively margin, is what I'm looking at in terms of the ultimate depth. And I get a bit worried about the voluntary market approach being able to get there, because you run out of margin pretty quick in terms of the sectors involved.
You can deliver more cost-effective reductions, and I think the IEA said something along the lines of a billion tons per annum out of Africa for clean cooking. Is that the right order of magnitude?
I mean, that's the current sort of level of pollution. Whether you can solve all of that is a big if. I'm doubtful, but certainly taking a big chunk out of that with sustained investment and with regulated carbon pricing that grows over time, and a focus on on actually doing the hard work of solving for modern energy systems, I think that's possible. Yeah.
So David, I think it's fair to say Microsoft has a higher willingness to pay. So when you're thinking about scale, are you focusing on the removal side? How many tons of removals are you thinking about?
I mean, so in our most recent sustainability report, which we published 2-3 weeks ago, I mean, certainly in the last month, I mean, we were very public that we so far contracted for 30 million tons of carbon removal offtake agreements, but recognize that we as a business need to do more, and the sort of business community and then society more broadly needs to do more. So there's clearly, we're going to continue on our journey, but we clearly want more people to join the sort of voluntary market space and take confidence in the fact we're there alongside a few other businesses who are able to deploy capital now. And we've partly done that by having internal carbon fee that we've increased pretty much every year since that was introduced, and that's I'm sure many of the organisations represented in the room do something similar. So those who are aware of this, that's levied on every single Microsoft employee and is there to encourage change of behaviour. So you hit the reduction side as well as then being able to fund removals.
Yeah, so if you think about SBTI, it's not a question, by the way, but the sort of the residual emissions is sort of 90 to 95%. If you look at CO2 alone, we're about 40 billion, so take 10%, that's 4 billion tons of removals need to be produced in sort of 20 odd years' time. That's a lot of tons. So let's go back to the behavior side and what's called the seemingly insignificant factors. So a seemingly insignificant factor refers to a detail or element that appears a minor or trivial at first glance, but can have a meaningful or disproportionate impact on outcomes, decisions, or behaviors. My most memorable one is reading Nudge, and it was about pension savings, where they basically went from opt-in to opt-out, I think. So a question for all of you, if you want to. If you're in charge of the climate risk nudge unit, what would your first thing to do if you're in charge? We'll come to the expert first.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, they are really, I mean, they're just seemingly irrelevant because they are super relevant. And that's the difference between economics and behavioral economics, that we simply empirically see and test. Does it matter? And very often those seemingly irrelevant factors, whether you call the same policy a tax or an offset, whether you use gain framing or loss framing, and whether you pay the climate bonuses back at the beginning of the year or at the end of the year, or whether you just deduct those rebates from the taxes, or whether you make it a very clear and visible and salient statement at the beginning of the month or beginning of the year and say, this is for clean cooking stoves. So these are all things that really matter for the uptake and for the approval, and therefore for the success of those policies. So what I would do, and I talk to many nudge units worldwide, I would try to kind of normalize carbon pricing as a mainstreamed, even so popular, positive policy that with a high acceptance and approval rate. And it's not that difficult because there's always winners and losers. And the question is who loses, who gains? What are the sentiments in a society? What are the ideas about fairness. So kind of polluter pays is something that people find fair, right? So it has a lot to do with how those policies are designed. And so it's about renaming, it's about moral reframing, which is more than just give it another name. And then also, I would also think about, think deeply about how to introduce such a policy. So for instance, if you phase in a policy starting with the bonuses, kind of to make people gain something. When I say people, it's households, but it can also businesses, depending on who is the demand side. It really, really matters because the first 12 months matter for an acceptance of a policy.
Anyone else? Anyone want to be an amateur climate nudge?
I can be, this maybe isn't a nudge, it's more an amateur assessment. I think at the end of the day, in order, again, to enable finance to flow, which enables everyone else to do what we're doing here, I think companies need to make money. And I feel like the framing to date, particularly in the voluntary carbon market, has been that profits are almost bad. Like we're trying to build this purity of a market that at its core is intended to do good and only good, which is good. I'm not saying we're not supposed to do that. But it's felt like a lot of framing has come around the sort of making profits is bad. I would reframe that. I think you need to build a market in which entities can be profitable. In order to drive scale. And so I would try to reframe around, if we are going to do this well, we need to have in companies that are regulated, they are governed, they are structured. It's not around necessarily quality and integrity, but it's about risk, how are we identifying and managing the risk at the outset of the project, and how are we governing those risks along the life of the project, such that all of us, and when I say all of us, it is the company that's investing, it's the off-taker, it's the developer, it's local communities. Everybody is coming out of this in a way that enables profitability for themselves, and that truly is how you get long-standing projects that get financed. So I think it would be a wording shift and a mentality shift in terms of why.
So one thing actually earlier with you, Greg, you talked about how the credit was basically subsidizing cheaper energy for the ratepayer. Is that a way of, does that message need to be clearer? So for example, if a government's collecting revenue from carbon allowances, could a government use that revenue directly to have like social tariffs? And could that change the thinking at the ground level where people think that carbon's more costly and it's impacting their pockets?
Yeah, I've seen those sort of proposals floating around, and they make sense in highly regulated, probably developed countries where you're talking about introduction of a regulated carbon price and trying to ensure that it's not utterly regressive and causing heating bills in winter to go up, right? And so I think it makes in complete sense in that scenario, basically, providing a corresponding subsidy, perhaps means tested in countries where you've got the data and the capacity to distribute that subsidy. So that's utterly logical. And so to the extent that that's a nudge, nudge sounds like it's behavioral, associated with consumer psychology. I'm having spent 25 years studying carbon markets and the last sort of dozen or so in them. I think that we need to move beyond nudges. I think that ultimately we don't have time to nudge CFOs into doing the right thing. I think we need to use a bigger stick. You think about tax policy nudges all sorts of corporate behavior. If you've been to Dublin recently, there's all the technology companies and the aviation leasing companies that were nudged there through incentives. Zug, Cayman Islands, they're nudges, right? And so similarly, if you have a carbon tax or a carbon price that is voluntarily established, you will find some people that are fantastic corporate citizens and do the right thing, and then you'll find the vast majority that say, thanks for the nudge suggestion, but I'm just going to sit this one out. Or to the extent that they pay, 80% of them are paying sub $10 a ton, and you end up with a peanuts and monkeys problem. Right?
What about a more negative label for those who aren't paying for any of their emissions? Because from where I sit, there's a little bit, it's almost if you don't pay, you get a better reputation than the people who are trying to pay for some of their emissions. So do we need like a climate insolvent label for the people who are not paying for anything?
I mean, you'd be labeling the vast majority of companies and humans in this room. Yeah, it's the most of the emissions are just not paid for. 75% is unpriced, according to the World Bank's recent report, right? So, I mean, I agree that there, the idea of naming and shaming tax cheats is a sensible idea, but we haven't even gotten to the point of imposing the tax yet, which is step one.
What do you think about that, Lucia?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I definitely would never suggest that a nudge is enough. I mean, not at all. I mean, I would definitely say exactly what you say. We're at a point where we need kind of quick and good regulation and good kind of, we need the markets to work. So this is also why we need a business case and not kind of the case for philanthropy. Philanthropy is great, but it's, again, not enough. But sometimes it just helps. The behavioral knowledge, the behavioral lens helps to make those harder policies more palatable, that people more approve, that they try to comply more than they do and go to the Cayman Islands. So it's never dramatic. It's always small, but I mean, empirically, we can show that it does kind of smooth and help the bigger policies, the most effective ones, to be more accepted.
To your point, in Canada recently, right, with the Carney election process, I found it amusing how the industrial carbon
Very
thing was like over there in the corner, and that was okay, but the consumer carbon tax, we got to ditch that consumer tax.
Got phased out, yeah. That's such an interesting case. Yeah.
Exactly that.
Okay, I'm sure that's going faster than our time. But, the origin of the Net Zero Delivery Summit is to provide a bridge between the COPs, and this panel is the bridge to the keynote from the COP30 president designate. So this is a mandatory question for all of you. With COP30 on the horizon, what single change, whether policy, perception, or product, would you most like to see by the end of this year to help carbon markets scale responsibly? Natalia.
I'm first. I was hoping to go after everyone else. The one thing I would do, I think we've talked a bit about, to some extent, about how voluntary is challenging. Also, I've obviously talked a bit about how do you enable finance to flow. I think in the absence of sort of accepted carbon markets pricing, I think demand signals from government would be probably my number one. I don't expect governments to all of a sudden just put in place regulation overnight. That's obviously impossible, but I think increasingly strong demand signals that there will be regulation, voluntary will be incorporated into ETS. I think when we work with our clients, again, largely financial institutions or investors, that's what is driving them to invest into carbon projects today, because they know they won't receive those credits really until the mid-2030s, and at that point, they're making the bet that there'll be those demand indicators. I think that would be probably my number one. My sub number two, if I'm possible to have two, would be, I think there is a lot of work that governments can do to enable more certainty in terms of enabling finance to flow into some of the deemed higher risk countries in this space. So for example, with letters of authorization or wider investment framework agreements, putting in place really legally binding contractual commitments and clear aspects of recourse if a party were to default upon that commitment would again de-risk investment for financial institutions and certainly enable insurance companies to ensure the political risk more effectively.
Greg?
What would I love out of COP30? 30 years in, right, there used to be this very clear objective around this multilateral process where there was both an environmental objective but also a developmental objective, particularly with regards to the global south. And in recent years, I've seen a pretty clear and consistent trend to throwing out the developmental objective, throwing out the global south from a funds flow perspective in order to focus just on the environmental objective, right? And there is a future here where you can see, I don't know, a California and a Sweden, trading with each other, 1,000-year durable removals under a very tightly regulated and perfectly measured system, and saying let's not bother about those poor countries which have not good enough regulation, not good enough governance, not good enough MRV, not good enough anything, because that doesn't fit our sort of nice walled garden view of the world. And I see Europe heading into that that sort of turn inward. I see America obviously turning inward, and so the notion of global development and environmental shared environmental outcomes through reduced emissions. I mean, they're starting to diverge, and I hope that the $1 trillion gap that was highlighted and was a big miss from COP29 actually gets back onto the agenda properly rather than just lip service.
Conscious of time, but probably two things. So one would be great for there just to be more demand for high quality carbon removal. I think that is probably obvious for everybody in this room, but less about the integration of voluntary carbon market and compliance markets as such, but more about how each market ensures they promote high quality projects so that you have a broader sort of carbon credit market develop. And then the second piece would be sort of thinking about one of the sort of sources of carbon, the fact that there's 700 to 800 million people in the world, predominantly in the global south, who still don't have access to safe, secure, clean electricity. So your point, if we don't start thinking about that as a key opportunity and a need to continue to focus on issues like that, the sort of removal side is going to be exponentially harder in the timeline we have.
Yeah, long list of wishes, but if I have to tell one, is I think the biggest barriers these days to scale carbon markets is actually the lack of trust, definitely on the demand side. So there were really, really bad headlines and a loss in the trust of the quality of carbon credits in the carbon market. And so I would love to see, the behavioral economist says that, a mandatory standardized disclosure of carbon credit quality down to the project level that absolutely clearly helps to develop and make those high integrity carbon credits thrive and drive the others out of the market.
All right, super. Well, huge thanks to Lucia, Brian, Greg, and Natalia for their insights. Thank you to the audience for your wisdom. And as Bruce Forsyth would say, what a lovely audience. You're so much better than last year. Thank you very much.